In this video, I'm going to address a message that someone sent me, a question that they were asking. The message reads, my husband is trying to figure out the inner parent, inner child via the Bible so that he can be more supportive. He's trying to understand where an inner parent talking to an inner child comes from. He thinks it's strange that the inner parent communicates with the inner child. This is a really good question, and I think that it needs to be asked because we want to be careful that we're not ingesting something that is coming from the world. And the original method of inner child and inner parent work comes from transactional analysis, which does come from the world. That comes from psychology. And so in a lot of ways, I kind of wish that I had just named it something else, but I also didn't want to take from something that someone started and not give them credit for it. Anyway, I did pray about this and ask God, do I need to change the language? Do I need to change, the name of this? And that was not something that he convicted me. He gave me peace about going ahead and doing this. So I don't entirely know why that is. I think that more will be revealed about that. But I think that my sense from him is that being able to understand that there is very literally an internalized inner parent and an internalized inner child is important. So just because the occult or the world is using certain language doesn't mean that we always have to give that to them. For example, I shared with you that when I published A Soul Aligned and then I went online to look for the book, a bunch of occult teachings came up and I was very upset, and I brought it back to God and I said, you gave me this title of the book. Why did you do that? And he let me know that the soul is his. Just because the occult has all of their woo-woo weird stuff that they do with regard to the soul and how they define the soul, that doesn't mean that they get to then just, covet that from God. And the same goes for children and parents. So I'm going to get into this. I'm going to explain this, but I want to kind of establish a couple things first. The first thing that I want to establish is this is a legitimate question. There is nothing wrong with asking this question. How does this fit with the Bible? And not only is there nothing wrong with it, but it's important for us to consider, because to just do something without asking these questions and without considering how does this fit with the Bible is wrong. If we're going to be healed by God, we have to stand on what he has taught. We have to make sure that everything fits in with him and that nothing is being added in. So I'm going to address this issue because it's not that we're adding in the world. We are going based on a design that God has already given us and how he commands us to get back into that design, to acknowledge the design and make sure that we are receiving the kingdom of heaven like a child, that we are doing our personal accountability work, and that we're receiving healing according to the way that he has designed us and intended. Before I get into that, because that's going to take a little bit longer to explain, I want to say that, and I don't know what this person's intentions are in terms of their spouse understanding their process, but here's what I want to say about this. In the world, when you're doing certain therapies and things like that, or based on what the world has established, there seems to always be this emphasis that other people need to understand you, that they need to understand you in order to be able to support you, and that they need to understand the process by which you're getting there. And there's nothing wrong with a couple, understanding what is one another doing, keeping each other accountable in terms of what we're dabbling in, right? Because we don't want, of course, if we're one with our partner, we want to know that they're not dabbling in the world. So that's legit. But the thing that I'm concerned about, and I'm not sure if that's how this person intended it, is so that he can support and be more supportive. And I want to make sure that it's perfectly fine for him to be supportive, but I want to make sure that this is not in a way that the world teaches. The world teaches that you have to understand my diagnosis, you have to understand my process, you have to understand the abuse that I went through and all of my deepest, struggles. And that ends up lending us to idolatry, because the only one who needs to understand us is God. We don't even understand ourselves. So there's no way for us to even ever communicate to a therapist or another human being what's going on with us. We need God to teach us what's going on with us. So what often happens in relationships as a result of the way that the world has trained us and taught us to think is that we think that our spouse needs to understand everything about us in order to support us correctly, or we're not going to heal. And that's wrong. That's setting up our spouse in a position of idol. That's passing off responsibility that we have to be confident in what God is doing in us and to stand on whether or not what he's doing in us is true. Everyone else doesn't have to agree with what you're doing. They don't even have to understand it. And truth be told, you actually don't always need the support of other people in order to heal. It's nice that they're supportive, but on the other hand, if they're too involved in your work, that becomes problematic because now you're answering to them rather than answering to God. So although in a spousal relationship, I believe that it's important to be accountable to each other, I do not believe that it is healthy or in line with scripture that person needs to understand you before you're going to heal. That person is going to come to understand you as you understand yourself when you're receiving that from God. I hope that's clear, but if it's not, please ask questions because it is an important posture to have. Even when I'm working with people, and for those of you who work with me, you know that I tell you, it's not that I don't care about your story, but I don't need to know your entire story. The only thing that I need to know is just enough to help shepherd you to God in the correct way, just enough so that I can understand, all right, here's where the bug is. This is what I'm seeing. This is what needs to happen. Now go do that with God. I don't need to, nor do I have the capacity to fully understand you. I'm not your God and I'm not your creator. And I did not set you apart before the creation of the world for a purpose. I am not doing anything through you. I'm not building you. I'm not sovereign over the circumstances in your life. These are things that you need to be bringing to God. And then once you do that, you're able to have integration of your experiences. The symptoms will remit because no longer do you need that in order to be motivated to do the work. So that will remit and the lesson will integrate. And then you're going to be able to go to me or your spouse or other people who are in your life, and you're going to be able to have an effective and personally accountable dialogue with that person. Now, a lot of times what happens is that when someone enters a therapeutic process, what they begin to do is they begin to excuse themselves from their bad behaviors by saying, well, I did that thing because my dad just never validated me and he never blah, blah, blah. They don't need to know all that. Or they'll come back and they'll say, I'm sorry. And then they'll give you the whole story of why it is that they did that based on their childhood trauma. Is that an apology for you or is that an apology for them? Because when you're apologizing and you're acknowledging your behavior, that is supposed to be in repentance, in change, and because you care about the other person enough to acknowledge that you impacted them. But what's happening in the world and in mental health is that everything gets excused. There's no personal accountability, and what is being taught as personal accountability is actually embedded in a gigantic excuse for bad behavior, for continually sinning against another person. And if we're continually sinning against another person, we can't keep ourselves from doing that because we're not actually healing and doing the work. The right thing to do would be to pull yourself out of that situation until you can get it together. It is no one's job to hear your story. That is for you to bring to God. And then you're going to know how to share with those who are close to you in your life or with whom you are one in a personally accountable way that does not place them in a position to cuddle you, to take care of you because you're so wounded and injured. That is not a healthy dynamic. That is a codependent dynamic, and codependency is inherently idolatrous. So I want to make sure right off the bat that you understand very clearly that your job is to do this with God. And only then are you going to understand how to have a healthy relationship with other people in which you are accountable. And now because you are accountable, you know what accountable behavior looks like in another person. All right, now that we've established that for the last 10 minutes, now, I mean, it was important, to go over that in a very clear and reiterated way. Now we're going to move into the question of the inner child and inner parent via the Bible, so that it's very clear why it is that we do things in this way. I've said to you in other videos, inner child and inner parent is not in the Bible. If we're looking at it as a method, no, inner child and inner parent work is not in the Bible. The tenets of what we're doing is very much in the Bible. The tenets of how God created his creations is very much in the Bible. And I agree with this statement that it is strange that the inner parent communicates with the inner child. It is strange until you do it, and then you understand and you receive wisdom from doing this work. If you've not done it, you're not going to understand. There are certain things that I cannot explain to you in this video that are only gained from actually doing this work. And look, if you have reluctance about this for whatever reason, a sin is a sin if you believe it to be a sin. So if you believe that this could potentially be of the world, what I would say is you need to step back, you need to do a fast, you need to be in God, you need to return to him, and you need to ask him, before I even dip my toe in this, is this from you? I don't have a problem with that. I don't gain anything from this here in this life to begin with. In fact, that is what I would want for you to do. And it's what I suggest to everybody. Anyone I'm going to work with has to do a fast. And as it stands, that is the first thing that I recommend to everyone in a Soul Aligned, in Heart Known series. You got to do the fast because God's got to be your number one. You have to be in him so that he's guiding your process. If you place this, even if this is from God, and you place this before God, before relationship with him, you're placing that up as an idol. You're placing my supposed expertise up as an idol. So you got to do that fast first, and you got to make sure that there's no idol in your heart. An idol itself is nothing. That's not what God is concerned about. He's concerned about if you have any doubt in your heart and you think this might be a sin and you do it anyway, then that's a sin against God. I have full confidence that if you do a fast and you pray to him, that he will speak to you and he will let you know if this is of him and if it's okay to proceed. Because I am a witness to what he's done in me, and I am a witness to what I've seen him do in others. But you can't live through my testimony. You have to live through your own, through the testimony that God is building in you. There are many things that have happened since God established his people and taught them how they were to live. The world has moved very quickly. The world has had a lot of ideas that they have planted, and God's people have accepted. They've mingled with the world, even though God told them that they were to be a holy nation separated. They, were scattered throughout the world. They were originally just in Jerusalem. Now we're throughout the world, and we have mingled with the world and become a part of the world and introduced the world into counterfeit Christianity. So wickedness has accelerated pretty darn quickly, and deception along with that has accelerated pretty quickly. What does God tell us about deception in the Bible? He says that you were handed over to delusion when you did not love the truth. So the further we've gotten away from Scripture and moved into idolatry of scriptural experts that, by the way, have been trained and taught in a university to read many books and ingest many false doctrines, not to stand on one word, one truth, and that becomes very dangerous. So there's a lot of toxification in terms of understanding how to heal. It's just completely been toxified. God said one thing is required in order to heal. Return to him and he will return to you. And then he says, return to him in sackcloth and ashes, humility, repentance, turn from your wicked ways. So let me ask you something. If God meant for that to be such a simple process of just hitting your knees and saying, okay, I'm here, And there's no ministry to be received. There's no healing to be received. God said, I will heal you. He didn't say, I'm going to wave a magic wand as the world teaches you. There is a process of healing. If you're in him, you know that. There is a process for healing. So why is it that so many people have not healed? If there is balm in Gilead, why is it that there is no healing for the daughter of his people? Because we've been handed over to delusion, because we did not love truth, we did not stay to the purity of his word, we did not make sure that we were a holy nation that was to be isolated from the rest of the world, not to become part of the world and not to ingest their doctrines, including in their sciences, their false gospel that was fundamentally predicated on rejection of God. Rejection that there's even a creator. So you understand that these are many of the reasons, not all, but many of the reasons why we are living in delusion and deception, and there's no healing for the daughter of his people. We can't break apart every single and dissect all of those different things. We know that wickedness has increased. We know that we go to scientific experts before we go to God. You can't deny that. The majority of people who contact me don't even contact me because they're really interested in Christianity or a biblical approach. They contact me because I'm a psychologist. And then the majority of them who contact me say that they contacted me because I'm Christian. But when I start speaking on biblical principles, they reject it because they actually just wanted a psychologist who claims to be Christian. That's what they wanted. They wanted a Jesus-light approach. This teaching is too hard. That's where we're at in history. And it shouldn't be too difficult for you to conceive of, because that's what was happening when Christ was here as well. People didn't want the message. They wanted, tell me what works I need to do. I'll do anything. That's what I hear over and over from people. I'll do anything. Yeah, I don't doubt that you'll do anything by your works. But the work of God is this, to believe in the one he sent. And if you believe in the one he sent, then you'll obey what he has said. And that work is done in the heart. Oh, well, I'll do anything except that, because that's too hard, and that's not even in my repertoire at this point in history. Now let's compare the life that we're living now to the life that God established for his people. They worked the fields. They trained their children up in the way that they should go. They knew that wisdom was the most important thing. They had no electronics, no TVs to distract them from what they're supposed to be feeling right before they go to bed. They paid attention to their dreams. They were spiritually nourished by a mother who stayed home. They were spiritually led by a father who knew that his most important role was to lead his family as Christ leads the church. Children were continually being nourished within a righteous and holy family unit. What does life look like today? And as a result of life looking like that, what do you think is going to happen inside of a child being raised in a family where there's typically only one parent? There's a superficial, counterfeit version of Christianity being taught in the home that is either completely not applicable, the parents are not living it out, it does not offer healing, it's being lorded over people, or people are being taught that they've already received salvation, so they're good. Nothing else to do here. We're just waiting for Christ to come and pick us up before this whole tribulation happens. I mean, look around. Is there tribulation, guys? What do you think happens to a child that's growing up in that environment? Doesn't matter if it's normalized. Doesn't matter if you think that that's normal. That people don't sit down and they're not to dinner at night and talk and share what God is doing in their lives. That children are not being led in the way that they should go, and they're not seeing examples of righteousness and holiness within a family. They're not being taught truth. They start to have feelings about something, feelings that, by the way, God has too, and rather than being taught how to relate with those feelings so that they can receive what God's doing in them, they're told, no, you're a big boy, don't cry. Get back up and go play. Don't bother mommy. Mommy's on her phone right now, I'm doing something. Here's an iPad. These children are being pummeled by spiritual warfare that is being acted out in their homes, and they don't even know what that is. They don't even know that when that's happening, that they're being provided an opportunity to choose God and receive what he's doing in their lives, and to understand that the devil every time is going to have his own version of what he's trying to do in this situation. They don't even understand what this circumcision from the sinful flesh, discipline in the physical flesh, how to live in the heart and spirit, how to relate with the feelings and the design that God has given them, how to understand their dreams, how to understand circumstances. Because you know what? The parents aren't living that out, so they're not able to teach that to their children or model it. They're checked out. And no wonder it's so easy to distract us with all this technology and compulsion, because the minute those feelings start coming up, they don't even know what that is, and they don't know how to deal with it. They don't understand that that is God talking to them. That is God calling them in. When I send these things, they don't understand that when God starts sending floods, when he starts sending hail, when he starts sending fire, when he sends wasting disease, what did God establish, you guys? He established for us to return to him. But the minute those feelings start coming up, we run. We fool ourselves into believing that we've returned to him, but we haven't. Because if you can't feel the feelings he's giving you, you will not be able to receive the ministry he's attempting to enact in you. I have heard so many pastors preaching a counterfeit version of Christianity because they're upset with self-help, but they don't turn around and look at what they're doing. That they're preaching just as superficial as of a method as self-help. If they actually had healing in their own lives, they would know that emotions are important. But I've heard them say, people like Vodi Bakum, John MacArthur, Justin Peterson, implying that emotion is a hindrance, that emotionality is a problem. Are we reading the same Bible? Because my Bible has God lamenting and grieving over detestable things that are being done in his holy nation. My Bible says that God goes around and his servant, his angel, goes around and puts a mark on the forehead of those who grieve and lament the detestable things that are done in his temple. My Bible says that God feels joy, that he feels sadness, that he feels anger. He feels all of the emotions that we feel. He feels jealousy. How is it possible that God created us with the same emotions as he has, but that's wrong? God has modeled for us that what he feels with his people and about his people affects the way that he behaves. Now, here's what we need to understand. The problem comes when we have emotions and then we just start acting out of those emotions. We haven't stopped to relate with those feelings and to understand what God is raising in his own creation, what he's calling you in to deal with him. We don't even know how to do that. Sounds like crazy talk, doesn't it? What I'm saying. And the reason we don't know how to do that, and we've completely even lost the comprehension of that kind of a repertoire, is because of the very things that I'm saying. There's no mother spiritually nourishing her children in the home. There's no father spiritually leading the family as Christ leads his church. There is no investment. It is completely broken down, the family system, the things that we've ingested in this world, like feminism, like a have-it-all lifestyle. We've ingested so much of the world that we don't even know what God requires anymore. Inner child and inner parent, as I teach it, not as the world teaches it, is based on the understanding that these parts of us have not developed. They did not develop in a healthy home. They did not develop within a healthy Christianity. These parts of us have not developed in truth because of the increase in wickedness in this world. In a healthy family, when a child is in a crib and they're crying, the parent is going to respond to that child. They're going to look at that child. They're going to see them, know them, and respond to them. They're going to see that they're crying. They're going to know them through relationship. Even though that baby can't talk, they are going to understand and come to learn what those cries mean. If that child is crying hysterically, there's something wrong. And you're going to recognize the hysterical cry of your little child, of your little baby. And you're going to look to see, okay, my child's in pain. Something's wrong. Through relationship with your infant, God has designed you in relationship with your infant to have wisdom. There's a passage in scripture where I think God's talking about the stork, and it's in Job. And he talks about how the stork is abandons her eggs, doesn't have sense because God hasn't given it to her. She goes through all this labor and doesn't have wisdom or sense. So don't think that this is something in you, like your maternal instinct that somehow comes from you. God put that there. He put that there in your design so that you can understand certain things. You're going to listen to your child, and you're going to, through relationship with them, even though they don't know how to talk, you're going to understand when they're in pain, when they're hungry, when they're tired, etc., when they're wet. Isn't that amazing? You don't even have the ability to talk with your infant, or they don't have the ability to talk with you and respond to you, and yet you can communicate. I've heard stories of people who had spouses who were dying from Lou Gehrig's disease and they couldn't even talk anymore. But they had ways of communicating spirit to spirit. I have in-laws who don't even speak English, and there's a love and an adoration and a camaraderie without me speaking Spanish and without them speaking English. That's been built into our design. Relationship has been built into our design. You think that's hardwired in the brain and whatever else? No, it's in our soul. God designed us as a soul. When my child is crying, I don't feel that in my brain. I feel that in the depths of my soul. This is the communication that God established between parent and child. And even at a physical level, with a mother, she's one with that child. There's symbiosis. That child grew in her body. That communication is supposed to be there. As that infant proceeds in development, don't listen to this from an academic perspective. God established this development. This is by God's intentional design of his creations for a reason, by the way. It's not arbitrary. So when you're sitting and listening to a scientific expert talk about development, even though they're not saying it, they have fundamentally been trained that everything that happens within our design is the result of evolution. Even if they identify themselves to be scientists, they're still speaking on that fundamental premise because that's their training. That's why you never hear them talk this way. That's why you never hear them put the pieces together of why it is that God designed us this way for his end game. And I'm going to put those pieces together for you because his authority is the one I speak on. I don't speak on the authority of science. As that child begins to develop from a totally dependent infant who could not take care of themselves whatsoever, could not wipe themselves, brush their teeth, soothe themselves when they're crying, when they're in pain, they can't articulate their needs. As they begin to develop, they're starting to develop two things. From that totally dependent state, they're beginning to transition into having personal accountability and being able to have a relationship with God. That capacity is continuing to develop until they are a healthy, spiritually blossomed adult. They still have developmental dependency needs for a period of time, but they are beginning to develop into an adult who no longer has human developmental dependency needs. Now they have transitioned to where they need to where they have been designed to engage in personal accountability and correct relationship with God. Personal accountability includes being able to do the basic things, right? So we learn how to pick out our own clothes, dress ourselves, bathe ourselves, brush our teeth, make good choices, feed ourselves. Later, we begin to develop the capacity to reflect on our behaviors. I've shared that when my daughter was a child, if she engaged in something that she wasn't supposed to engage in, she was required to, at a certain point, when she had the developmental capacity to do this, she would sit down and write sort of a template of what was the behavior, what was I trying to accomplish, was that the best way to get it done, what happened instead, what do I need to do differently, do I owe anyone an apology? So now you see that this child is developing the capacity to reflect on their own behaviors and to develop an internalized capacity to reflect in a way like that, to ask herself those questions. So she's grown into an adult woman who's capable of asking herself those questions. Why? Because of an essay? No. Because of the relationship that she and I had, the spiritual nourishment. Even though I didn't know Christ at the time, I was nourishing my child. I was actually parenting my child. And that's missing. You see that it's missing. A child does something wrong and they're continuing to be parented as one would parent a small child who doesn't even have the capacity to reflect and talk. At best, they're just being parented in a behavioral way. You did that thing? Okay, well, you're going to get your phone taken away. I'm not saying that those consequences aren't sometimes appropriate, but in the absence of sitting down with your child and talking these things through and helping them to understand there's a different way they can do things. This is the way. This is appropriate behavior. This is good behavior. This is what you do when you've hurt someone. In the absence of that, you don't develop the internalized capacity to do that, and you grow into an adult who, I'm going to give you an example. All of us have had crazy experiences with people in a business, correct? I had an insane experience the other day where something was being delivered, and as it was being delivered, the person scraped my floor, damaged my doorway, and at a certain point, I just kind of stopped him and I said, hey, you're damaging my property as you're bringing this in, and he turned around and put the thing back in his truck and drove off. And when I spoke with the CEO of the company, who was very apologetic, but also very much focused on the fire, putting out the fire, and appeasing me, I said, literally when he called, I was in the process of filling out a police report because the guy's behavior was so erratic that I wanted to make sure that if he came back to retaliate, that I had something documented with my police station. And when I told him that, he said, oh, please don't do that, and whatever else. The guy had also tried to get me to write a personal check to him rather than to the company, so I was a little concerned about criminal behavior there. Nevertheless, as I was speaking with the owner, he really just wanted to kind of move things along and didn't want me to fill out this report. And I said to him, I started asking questions. Well, why don't you want me to fill out this report? I'm a little confused. The guy was willing to steal from you. So I don't know the backstory. I'm never going to know what the actual deal is. But I did say to him, look, I believe in extending mercy, but he needs to call me and apologize for his behavior. I'm sorry, but it's not enough. And that is not biblical to just continue to move forward. You want to continue to do business with me. You want me to be okay. You want me to relent on the police report that I'm getting ready, that I'm in the process of filing. Okay, I'm willing to do that, but he needs to repent. Here's the thing. This is the reason why I'm bringing this up, is because this isn't even in our repertoire anymore. We require our young children to say sorry, but we don't require adults to do that. What kind of world are we living in? It's bizarre, you guys. It's bizarre that we don't have this internalized representation of how we're supposed to be, who we're supposed to be. And this is because of the increase in wickedness. This is because of the breakdown in family structure. And it is because Christianity, counterfeit Christianity, is ingesting more doctrine of the world than they are of the actual word. We have not set ourselves apart to be isolated from the rest of the world. And so we have internalized the world. We ingest what the world says about healing, and then we wonder why we're not healing. Our design is to continually be built by our human parents, and our human parents are supposed to be building us and shepherding us in such a way that we're going to internalize a representation of how God parents us correctly. They're not going to engage us codependently. They're not going to do for us what we are supposed to be doing for ourselves, because they understand that that is then going to present a stumbling block and a hindrance to our relationship with God. If that's how they're parenting us, that's what we're going to require of God. And God doesn't parent us that way. And we see that this attitude is problematic in counterfeit Christianity. That in our covenant, we believe that God has done everything for us that we're supposed to do for ourselves and in obligation to him. Now, here's where inner child and inner parent work comes in. The ways in which you are interacting with your primary caregivers is going to become an internalized representation of the way that you're going to relate with yourself. You had a harsh parent, you're going to relate with yourself in a harsh way. You had a parent that sat you before an iPad and never, was completely disengaged. You're going to be disengaged with yourself, and you're going to have no self-control. You're going to have learned to live according to the flesh. And so there's no way that you could be living in your heart and spirit where the Holy Spirit is. And he's the one who gives you self-control. He is a spirit of sound mind, love, power, and self-control. You have a parent that's not leading you and not spiritually nourishing you. You're not going to understand what spiritual warfare is, and you're going to fall victim to these counterfeit, false teachings within Christianity regarding spiritual warfare, that the devil has more power than God. You're not going to understand that God sends all things, that he's sovereign, and that when circumstances, feelings, dreams, memories, that these are not, your memories aren't flashbacks. They're memories that God's raising to the surface for you to deal with. Your circumstances are not the devil pummeling you. They are circumstances that God has sent to build you if you turn to him. But in all things that God sends, you have a choice to make, whether you're going to turn to him or you're going to turn to the enemy. The only way that the enemy has a foothold in your life is if you turn to him, if you start giving him power. And so doesn't it behoove him to establish a false doctrine that he has so much power so that you're focused on him rather than the power of God? I can't just tell you these things. You have to get these things integrated inside of you. You've got to sort through all the feelings that are happening inside of you, all the questions that you have. And in a parent-child relationship, you would have internalized an inner parent. In fact, you did internalize an inner parent. Sometimes that inner parent is not so good. So now what you're doing is you're bringing intention and personal accountability to restructuring the inner parent that you are relating with. This process between inner parent and inner child is already happening inside of you. We're just giving it a name and we're giving it intention. And the reason why it's so important for us to be hearing from our inner child is because Christ said for us to become childlike, not childish, childlike. Childish is a child who begins to throw a tantrum because they don't have a parent who's able to respond to them correctly, who's able to regulate them, who's able to give them structure, give them understanding, give them parameters of good behavior, give them consequences. Childish is one who is living in their flesh, and childish is not always a child. It's very often, at this stage in history, we have a lot of childish adults, those who don't know how to process their feelings between this internalized parent and this internalized child. So they are compelled in their flesh. They live in a childish way. They don't know how to express their feelings or to be tender, which occurs in the heart and spirit. As you are doing that inner child and inner parent work, again, not as the world does it. The world does this as a practice of self. We do this according to the word. As you begin to relate and give that inner child, the childlike part of you, a voice, you're going to discover humility, wisdom, because that little child is going to give it to you straight. That little child is not toxified, is the most pure form of God's creation. That little child is going to be capable of saying, I'm really sad right now. I'm really mad. I don't want to do this thing. Well, why don't you want to do this thing? Because I'm scared. You understand, you're going to start to uncover why it is that you feel a particular certain ways in different situations. That is part of the personal accountability that you would have been developing through relationship with a primary caregiver who had developed themselves into a spiritually healthy, blossomed adult. One who has understanding, who's able to relate with God correctly. And here's what happens. When we're living in our flesh, we don't get to experience God. So those two parts of us that we're supposed to split off from dependence into personal accountability and a healthy relationship with God, if you don't have personal accountability, you don't have relationship with God, because he's not going to relate with you in a codependent manner. He's not going to do the things for you that you're required to do for yourself. And secondly, you will not be able to bring yourself to him correctly. Because if you don't have personal accountability, you're living in your flesh. So you're going to bring yourself to him in your flesh, an impetuous flesh, desperate, demanding, without understanding, without wisdom of who you are and who God is to you and who you are to him. You're not going to understand the posture that you're supposed to get into in order to receive from him, in order to be ministered to. You won't be able to recognize it. You won't be able to receive it. I hope you can see that although inner child and inner parent work is not a method in the Bible, the concept of inner child work and what we are attempting to implement and build inside of you is absolutely 100% biblical, first of all, because God does require us to take personal accountability. He does require us to search our hearts and to relate with the design he's given us. And it is based on the developmental design that God has given us. That in a healthy situation, your parents were entrusted to witness you and to shepherd you back to God through relationship, example, teaching, instruction, spiritual nourishment, and leadership. Your parents are imperfect. Everybody has different situations, and healing has largely been removed from the earth because we rejected the healer, quite frankly. We chased after the science gods. God told us he's our healer, but we wanted a different God. God laid out the expectations, but we ran to mental health and counterfeit Christianity to tell us what we should do. So he hands us over to the spirit we choose. But this is providing you an opportunity to build those parts of yourself that did not fully develop. And that isn't anyone's responsibility. And so I go back to what I talked about at the beginning of the video. If your parents came back and they said, you know what, we realized the mistakes that we made and we're going to reparent you. Guess what? That time has come and gone. They have to deal with the mistakes they've made and you've got to deal with the consequences. There can be acknowledgement if the parent is willing to do that, but it's not going to heal you. You are responsible at this point. There's no going back. That time has come and gone. No one can do this work for you. You are responsible for building those parts of you with God, for learning how to relate with the design he's given you, for examining your heart, for being able to soothe yourself, for being able to have a way that you process through these things. And listen, in mental health, one of the biggest problems in mental health is that they put this on the partner. They put this on the spouse to do the work for you that you have to do for yourself. You're not designed for anyone to do this for you. That time has come and gone. It's your job. And the good news about that is that you don't have to depend on anyone anymore for your healing. You have the ability to do that work, and no longer are you dependent, but you are reliant on God. You do your part, he does his part. You do your personal accountability work, and then you receive his ministry and he does the healing. You're not depending anymore. You are relying. Because in a dependent relationship, you would kick and scream and say, God, do this for me. Sound familiar? That is what most people are doing. And that is why they're not healing, because God never established a codependent relationship with his people. I don't see one instance in scripture that talks about us being dependent on God. We are reliant on him. We don't wake up in the morning and kick our feet and say, God, go to work for me. God, I don't want to clean my house. Clean my house for me. He doesn't engage us that way. And the same thing goes for the design that he's given us. He's not going to soothe our feelings. He's not going to process our feelings. He's not going to give us his spirit of peace until we've done the work that we have to do. In the absence of having been raised to do that work, we will not have an internalized representation of how to do that. That is what you're building in inner child and inner parent work. You are learning to see, know, and respond to your inner child. You are learning to recognize and acknowledge the design that God has given you and to respond to what he has done rather than what you prefer in your flesh. You are learning to be personally accountable for your part in the covenant. God says, examine your heart. You need a way to do that. So you see, God is not unilateral. He's not compartmentalized. He hasn't designed you just sort of arbitrarily. He has designed you in order to understand your covenant. You're not going to heal until you do what you need to do. He has given you an opportunity to be reconciled to him because you couldn't have been reconciled otherwise, because you're not capable of doing this work perfectly. That does not mean that you are not required to do this work. He has designed you for his end game goal. His end game goal is for you to be saved, for you to fulfill your part of the covenant so that you will be saved. That is why you have the design that you have, and that is why you must understand your design if you're going to heal. Thank you so much for listening to this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask your questions in the comments section, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.